Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this important and exciting event. As you all know, we are going to be celebrating for 3 years, the 50th anniversary of the First World Roma Congress, a very significant event in the history of the struggle for Roma rights and the struggle for recognition of the Roma peoples. So my name is Jacqueline Bhabha, and I'm a professor at the Harvard-Chan School of Public Health. And also I am the director of research at the François Xavier Bagnoud FXB Center for Health and Human Rights. And it's my great pleasure, together with my colleague, Dr. Margareta Matache, to have worked for some years building our Roma program. So I am going to be chairing this first panel. As I said, this is the first of 3 days of discussion looking at a whole range of issues related to Roma mobilization and milestones in the struggle for recognition of Roma rights. We are going to convene a broad range of experts, both activists and scholars, both members of the Roma community and others who are involved and engaged with Roma issues. And we're going to look at a range of struggles and their relationship to issues that affect Roma people, because of course the Roma struggle for rights and Roma issues related to stigma and discrimination are not in any way unique. They have special impacts and special inflections, but there are many other communities worldwide that share many features. And one of our important challenges is to create commonalities, to build solidarity, and to highlight the similar ways in which discrimination, exclusion, stigma operate in differently situated communities. So I'm delighted to say that we're kicking off this event with a very strong panel. And I'll just briefly introduce my 4 colleagues who are going to make contributions, short contributions, and our discussant. And then I will start off by asking each of them a question or two. I will raise some questions for the panel, and we'll very much look forward to also including questions and comments from all of you who are participating. So thank you again for this event. And I should also thank, in particular, my colleagues who have organized this event. It's a joint effort of several institutions, and all these big events, of course, always take multiple players. So in this case, it's not only the FXB Center at Harvard that has been involved, but also the Romani Studies program at the Central European University and the Department of Romani Studies at Södertörn University. So these are the key agents, if you like, of this set of events. So thank you to all of you kind of in the front line and behind the scenes who've made this event possible. So let me start by just briefly introducing our panelists. My first panelist is Dr. Angela Cotsey, and she teaches at the, hang on, let me just find the proper description. Give me 1 second. She teaches at the Central European University, where she is an assistant professor of Romani Studies and the chair of the Romani Studies program. My second panelist is Michelle Morse, who is the Chief Medical Officer and the Deputy Commissioner for the Center for Health Equity and Community Wellness at New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. My third panelist is Liepollo Pheko, a Senior Research Fellow at Trade Collective and a member of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and Ambassador and a Lancet Commissioner on the Reparations and Redistributive Justice Report. And finally, last but certainly not least, Deputy Dean of the School of Law, Eddie Bruce Jones, who is based at Birkbeck College in London, at the University of London, where he is a reader in law and anthropology. These are our eminent four panelists. And then to respond to their comments, we have Dr. Sunnie Rucker-Chang, who's an assistant professor of Slavic and East European Studies and director of European Studies at the University of Cincinnati. So as you can see, we have a wonderfully broad and diverse set of experts to kick off this event. So let me start off, if I may, by just having said that this is an important convening of a very important historical moment. Let me start off by asking Angela, Dr. Cotsey, please. 50 years after the first Roma Congress, what are the milestones, the changes, and the backlogs as you see them in fighting against anti-Roma racism? So Angela, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and happy International Romani Days. And so I would like just quickly reflect on the milestones and as well as the changes and the backlogs in fighting against anti-Romani racism. And actually there's a really interesting coincide because we just published a book in the last February with Huub van Bar. We edited the book, and the title is The Roma and the Struggle for Identity in Contemporary Europe. Unfortunately, the COVID is absolutely took the book launch, so we didn't have, but we wrote an intro as well as the conclusion where basically it's a kind of stock taking. So what happened since 1971, but as well as another milestone in the life of the Romani movements, 1989. So in the post 1989, so widening and deepening the various formal and more informal Romani social movements have had a profound impact on making Roma publicly visible and audible on political policy, cultural and public debates about their social position within and beyond the contested borders of Europe. And if you remember that we also had a very wonderful roundtable 1 or 2 years ago at Harvard, which was completely like as a global dialogue. So Roma really become visible, not just in Europe, but at the global stage. And throughout the 1990s, since the beginning of the new millennium, what has become known, the Romani movement has increasingly become more diverse, intersectional, and transnational, and by developing their own heterogeneous social movements, those Roma who have associated themselves with these movements and their various more or less institutional practices have increasingly entered the socio-political and cultural scene as an active agents of representation, not merely as a passive victims of representation and disputable identification by others. So I'm quoting this from this text because I think that's really, really important, that Roma is not just as an object of academic inquiries, but also as an active agent, basically have a presence at the global, international, national, and even local level as well. And even if we think about it, that today it has become really odd and even controversial to implement a social, political, cultural, or academic program without some forms of Roma participation, notwithstanding the fact that this still continues to take place. So I think that's comment in our writing is very important, that so as we had like 10 years ago, 5 years ago, all kinds of academic program without Roma, but nowadays that cannot happen because we have actually a tiny but a strong Romani intellectuals who are reclaiming their place in the academic sphere as well. And also, for example, if I'm thinking about the academic field, what happened in the legacy of 1971, for example, in the domain of history and memory, for instance, we have been able to observe a hard-won, but nevertheless increased sense of ownership over Romani histories and memories, and over sites, archives, institutions, and narratives key to historical awareness and collective cultural memories. This is particularly true for the histories and memories related to Romani Holocaust. So in this field, we have seen the continuation of struggles for the recognition of the occurrence and huge human and societal consequences of genocide and violent persecution. Although these struggles began soon after the Second World War, and for decades primarily took place in Germany. Since the 1990s, they have increasingly taken place all over Europe and become more impactful. So the Romani claims for the recognition of their histories have become public and more robust, and moreover have found significant inroads into institutional, cultural, and political infrastructure to allow for narrating and imagining Romani histories and memories as integral rather than marginal parts of national and European narratives. So also, if I'm thinking about, various projects which has been developed in the last couple of years, such as the Roma Archive project, have been really vital, not only in terms of reconsidering the position of Roma in European histories, but they have also been fundamental in the creation and performance of new narratives and memories regarding Romani identities, implicitly or explicitly critical of how canonical discourses about Europe have historically and until now often managed to exclude the marginalized and marginalize them. And in this respect, the establishment of the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture in June 2017 in the center of Berlin can be considered also one of the key moments in this kind of institutionalization and institutional building, in which Roma actors themselves create, perform, and institutionalize new narratives regarding their identities, histories, and memories, notwithstanding the complex history and disputes in the course of the 2010s, out of which area emerged. So, of course, these processes have not been homogeneous, just as the emergence and development of the Roma social and civil movement have throughout history has been highly heterogeneous societal process. But I could, unless many activities, I don't know how many minutes do I have, maybe just like in terms of achievement and milestone and changes. Also, I think it's a huge change that we are having this kind of roundtable discussions, right? Having this transnational dialogue with various colleagues and creating a language and narratives which can connect us. And I think that's absolutely important, although still we are, making some baby steps, but these baby steps are very important and very strong and very powerful. So I do believe in that. So
after that, maybe I could just jump in and say, first of all, thank you, and just point out that the difference between lying or crawling and walking for anybody who has a child, even if they're baby steps, is dramatic. So not to minimize, as you said, this is a beginning, but it's a hugely significant change in just the kind of, being talked about rather than having a voice. And I'm so glad we started with that. The agency, the kind of strong sense, like in other movements, that this mantra of nothing about us without us applies to Roma people. And I think this is a dramatic change, as you rightly say. And I think the point you made about histories is equally significant, not just as an academic issue, important though that is, but as a justice issue, as a rewriting of the record. So much of the narrative in Europe and actually globally has been a stereotypic narrative of Roma characterized in a very particular derogatory way. And I think this is an equally important point, that it's not just that now Roma are agents and spokespersons for their own struggle and their own history, but that very history is being formalized and actually reauthored. Yes, not just reinterpreted, but actually the nature of the history of what happened is being concretized. And your third point, I think, about how significant this set of dialogues and engagements, dialogues in the academy, but dialogues also in political context, in the European Union, in American Congress. I know, my colleague Magda has been very involved with American politicians too. This is really a very important transformation. So I guess the first takeaway is that actually in these 50 years, a lot has been achieved. So what I wanted, if you could just use a couple of minutes to say, against that positive backdrop of quite dramatic transformation, what do you see as the key areas where there still is a backlog, where there still is a kind of, if you like, unaddressed issues, which would be a kind of at the top of your transformative agenda? And I'm thinking in a way, particularly, I mean, just one issue which I think about quite a bit is this question of the historical record and school curriculum. It seems to me that is still an area where, millions of European children are still educated in a way which perpetuates rather than challenges the stereotypes that have long been handed down. That seems to me an area of urgent kind of need for engagement, but maybe there are developments that you could point to which are more positive, and other areas. So maybe just use a few minutes, I think I'll give you another 5 minutes, to say what you think would be the key issues, and then we will, we'll come back to some of these issues. Yeah. But I think it's great that you started with this really positive track record of significant achievement, and would just like to kind of now maybe bookend that with something which is where your key kind of to-do list would start.
Yeah, so thank you so much. So concerning challenges, I still would like to go back to our book, actually, in the conclusion, what we are writing about with Bhabha, with my colleague. So basically, we observe this kind of paralyzing contradiction, right? Between, on one hand, we see this unfolded, strengthened structural violence based on intersected, class, racialized, and gender societal division implicated in neoliberal capitalism. And on the other hand, there is some new opportunities of a new emancipatory grammar, political claiming, which constituted in a very heterogeneous Romani movement. So I think the main challenge is actually that how can we address this really paralyzing effect of social economic expulsion, what we are facing not just in Europe, but also several other places as well, and geographies at the global level. And also one other point, what I'm sure that we can develop this argument further with my colleagues. And the other point, what I would like to point out, that we as scholars, as people who are working in academia, we are always advocating for this very multidimensional analytical perspective based on a complex, intersecting dimensions of recognition, redistribution, and representation, just referring back to Nancy Fraser's claims, right? will neither change the asymmetrical power relation, nor address the sustained and reproduced political and epistemic violence without strong connections to forces on the ground, the social, political, and cultural struggles and movements that are required to grant the multidimensional perspectives, and in doing so, to enable linkages and solidarities between various racialized and marginalized groups and beyond artificial and counterproductive majority and minority binaries. And I think that that's really a challenge. And our hope is that we can enter into this kind of conversation about opportunities for this kind of linkages and solidarities, and hopefully we can find not just the language, not just the grammar of politics, but also the actions, the political actions. So how can we create a kind of collective indignation to fight against this kind of structural racism and structural violence what we are facing as a racialized, oppressed people. That's it.
Thank you so much, Angela. That's wonderful. So that's really a wonderful way to start, and also a wonderful introduction to our next panelist, because you talked about linking to forces on the ground, and I think our next speaker is exactly one of these forces on the ground. So, Michelle, thank you so much for joining us. As I said, you are very much based in the real world, so to speak. You work in New York City in the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, where you're the Deputy Commissioner for the Center for Health Equity and Community Wellness. So it's an extremely important job, really at the forefront of one of the key vectors of exclusion, which is access to health. So I wondered if you could, and of course, you're talking about a different community. Maybe there is Roma constituency in New York, but I doubt it's one of the key constituencies that you work with. So it would be great if you could maybe just also touch on similar issues. So in your work, on health equity and using global solidarity, social medicine and anti-racism education as tools for the work you do, what do you see as some of the milestones, some of the successes that have happened over the last period? Angela sort of took us back a long period. I don't know how long you want to look back, but it would be great to get a sense. And of course, this last period has been distinctively transformational. So it'd be lovely to hear from you. Thank you. And the floor is yours, Michelle.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Jacqueline, and thank you for the invitation to join this panel. I very much appreciate Professor Angela's words, getting us started and really setting the context for the conversation. And, again, just honored to be a part of this conversation commemorating the 50th anniversary of the First World Roma Congress. I would say that for me personally, global solidarity has always been a huge part of my work and my life, and how I have showed up in spaces and places. And being from Philadelphia and now working in New York City, of course, being one of the most global cities in the world, I've just been honored to be able to both learn from colleagues around the world and certainly be politicized by them. And then also it for me as a praxis has helped me to understand the situation of Black American women better as well. So I have felt both strengthened and have grown tremendously from the collaborations, friendships, and partnerships with my colleagues and partners around the world. And then, as I said, also found it to be transformative in my understanding of my place in this society and opportunities for transformational change here in the United States as well. But I want to also just lift up the fact that, again, standing in solidarity with Roma people around the world today in particular, and always, one of the things that has been clearer and clearer for me is just understanding racial capitalism. And I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. But to your question, Jacqueline, about kind of what are some of the milestones and how do we practice global solidarity and anti-racism, and kind of how have I been involved in that work? You know, it's the situation of racialized groups in Eastern Europe that helped me to understand capitalism a little bit better. And it's also been a huge theme in our work in my organization, Equal Health, our global campaign against racism over the past several years. And I want to talk a little bit more about that, but I just wanted to make that explicit connection between, you know, again, marginalization and oppression of Roma people in Eastern Europe, and the same for Indigenous people and Black people, descendants of slaves here in the United States, around racial capitalism. But in terms of milestones, I wanna start with the AIDS movement, because that is where I became politicized as a young health student. And it reminds me, just in thinking of my engagement in global solidarity work over the past 15 years, reminds me of how often solidarity comes from crisis. And the AIDS movement was, you know, I think what some people would say is the biggest public health crisis of the 20th century. And it was where, again, I began to really understand social and structural oppression. And it is also kind of where I certainly became politicized. But I want to just actually look, I'm not going to go all the way back to your question, Jacqueline. I'm just going to briefly think about a couple of touch points over the past decade that were particularly meaningful, both, I would say, to me and the organizations that I've been a part of over the past decade. So the earthquake in Haiti in January 2010 is the place I actually want to start. Because not only was it an unprecedented crisis, right? Over 300,000 people, if not more, who lost their lives in the earthquake, January 12th, 2010. And for me, I was young and early in my political education and trajectory, but it completely transformed my understanding of Haiti, a country I had already started to work in at that point. But it also just changed my understanding of what it means to be in solidarity as a Black American who's not of Haitian descent, but who speaks Haitian Creole and French, being in Haiti in the months after the earthquake, and doing, you know, direct service work and relief work, and then also being there during the cholera epidemic that happened just 10 months after the earthquake, and recognizing both the structural vulnerability, of course, that allowed for so many lives to be lost unnecessarily, and then also recognizing, just again, the radicalization and politicization of health workers in Haiti and health workers around the world, seeing the vulnerabilities that led to such a massive destabilizing loss of life. And to me, I think that is an important moment, because not only did me and several colleagues founded our organization Equal Health in the wake of the earthquake, because of that politicization, because of our recognition, our recognition of how unfair it was, frankly, that we were at these elite Boston white-led hospitals that had tremendous resources, tremendous infrastructure. And what we witnessed was a collapse of the entire health professional education system in Haiti because of the earthquake. And so that was a turning point moment for many of us. And it was a platform upon which I think we built not only just praxis around global solidarity, but again, political education of health workers and health students through social medicine courses, through various platforms. And so I want to highlight that as a flashpoint moment, as a turning point moment, as a critical moment for global solidarity for many of us in the past decade. I also want to, of course, talk briefly and highlight Occupy, Standing Rock, and Black Lives Matter, and the succession of those kind of three social movements here in the United States, although recognize, of course, that there were a lot of global connections as well for those movements. Those were also politicizing, and they are, critical consciousness at scale, right? That's what social movements do. But the corollary for the work I've been involved in for those three movements, but the Black Lives Matter movement in particular, since 2013, and obviously, with huge expansion after the murder of George Floyd as well last year. But part of what I think the colleagues, communities, and groups that I've been a part of have seen as a result of those three social movements and crises, right? To be, again, frank and direct, that a lot of the solidarity and movement building came from crisis for those three examples as well. For us, what that led to was a global campaign against racism, which I mentioned earlier. And we launched that campaign back in 2017, actually, in Navajo Nation, and are currently continuing to work on it. We're at the end of our third year of the campaign now. But the reason I mention it again is because it led to profound relationship building, solidarity, and again, we have 24 chapters across 10 countries. But I mention it again because of both crisis and the response being global solidarity, right, rather than nationalism. And I think it's really important. It's been important for me to just recognize those moments as again, moments of building together rather than building apart. And again, health workers saying that health is political, and really, again, being willing to expand our political education work rather than, I guess, resign ourselves to kind of technocratic solutions. And that, to me, has also just been a really, really important milestone. I've never seen so many health workers talking about abolition, for example. And that's also on the global scale. It's not just in the United States. And so we've had, just really, really powerful conversations, particularly over the past year in our campaign, about why this is a moment for health workers to really follow the lead of abolitionists around the world, from South Africa to Nigeria to the United States, and recognize that we need to be building community, building global solidarity, and building a shared political analysis. So that's just another milestone. But in terms of, I'm going to wrap up in the next couple of minutes, but in terms of changes, the things that I think I've seen changing, I want to go back again to the Black Lives Matter movement. For me, seeing solidarity between Palestinians and Black people in America around the Black Lives Matter movement, that was I say a change. There's a long history of that solidarity, but for me, in my short life, that was huge. That was another change moment that blew my mind, and I had the honor myself of getting to go on a delegation to Palestine a couple of times over the past 5 years. And again, the conversations that I was able to have about the links between Palestinian independence and sovereignty and the Haitian Revolution, and the relationship between Napoleon coming and trying to conquer Palestine, and similarly failing as he did in Haiti, in Palestine. Those are conversations. That was a huge change for me. That was a new level of global solidarity and anti-racism that is unforgettable for me. I think another change that I've seen is health institutions, especially elite white health institutions, doing some more serious thinking about institutional racism. And I've seen that at Brigham and Women's Hospital, which is where I've practiced from 2008 until I took this job in New York City just a couple of months ago. That has been a change that's very encouraging for me, and again is due to the organizing and sacrifices of BIPOC organizers in the Black Lives Matter movement, in particular in the United States. And then the third change I want to really lift up is racial capitalism being the central kind of organizing framework and theory for our global campaign against racism. And it's not to say that structural racism isn't still central to our work, but bringing in the lens of racial capitalism has been even more profound and applicable, and again connects to the Roma in particular, as a way for us to understand what is wrong with health and healthcare and healthcare access around the world. It has been transformational in our campaign work. And the fourth is healing justice. And healing justice is a framework that really brings in the importance and the need for us to recognize harm to BIPOC health workers and healers in our organizing and in our work to try to transform the medical industrial complex. And Kara Page has been a partner to us in that work and in bringing in healing justice into a lot of our organizing, recognizing that we have to, both find ways to reconcile and heal as we build power and as we build global solidarity for transformation. That is a change that I think would not have happened again in the past decade in our work if it weren't for both crisis and global solidarity. And then finally, I'll just say in terms of backlogs, we have far more work to do in healing justice. I think that I list it as a backlog because a lot of that work has been undone for many, many years in the organizations I've been a part of and has to accelerate and be more central. I think the second is struggle and reckoning and escalation of tactics. I think that is inevitable. We're on a collision course in so many ways in the United States and globally with systems of oppression, and I see that as being something that's going to continue to need to accelerate. And then I think the last backlog I'll mention is just class struggle and class consciousness for doctors, nurses, and other health workers. But I mentioned doctors and nurses because we have disproportionate power, privilege, resources, wealth, et cetera, in the medical industrial complex. And so I think the class struggle and class consciousness for us as health workers is something that we're going to have to confront more directly, more openly, very, very soon, if not already. And that's why racial capitalism, again, has been so helpful for us as an organizing framework. So that was, I spoke much longer than I was planning to, but that's what comes to mind.
Really a fabulous set of reflections. Thank you for those. I just love the way in which you really instantiate what global solidarity means, starting with, what you said about the lessons you personally learned from, Europeans, East Europeans, and their struggles, and then, dramatically linking it to AIDS and then to Haiti, and then this kind of enormously broad canvas that you draw, where you really give us an insight into your own personal kind of political education. But in doing that, you also show us how much these commonalities really need to inform the way we think and the way we organize. So I think that's really tremendously helpful. I mean, I think, from the kind of detail of Napoleon, which I'd not thought of, the Palestinian struggle in a way is such an iconic struggle. I know that, they're close links. For example, I'm from the UK, as you can hear, there are very close links between the Irish and the Palestinians because, British colonialism and capitalism has operated in similar ways against these two sections. So there are many, many similarities. And so thank you for drawing our attention to that. Thank you also for the point you made about crisis. Crisis is a strange word in a way. Crisis kind of is a kind of very particular word which we could discuss, but in a way you're right that this notion of crisis is also very powerful as a tool for change, and it's an opportunity for mobilizing, it's an opportunity for challenging. And so I think it's really, and clearly we're in that kind of moment, and we've been through it in the last couple of years with the previous administration and with the murders of so many Black people and so on. So I think in this country, but elsewhere too. So I think that's a very powerful insight that you give us as well. That crisis is both a situation of, or can be a situation of desperation and a situation of opportunity. Finally, your last point, I loved the way you talk about this the kind of cultural and social oppression and the power of the medical profession. I mean, because you're in the medical profession, and so that's right. I'm in the legal profession. I would have said exactly the same about lawyers.
Right.
And people who are in education may say that, and people who are in architecture and planning would say that. Wherever we are is the right place to start.
That's right.
And so your point about that is a really important one. That's where you work, that's what you know about, and that's where you have the most agency.
That's right.
And I think that's such an important observation for our students too. And, hopefully some students and young people are listening to us. I mean, you don't have to go across the world. You can have the most influence, and you can do the biggest changes in your own neck of the woods. And so thank you for those comments. They're really wonderful. And I so enjoyed what you had to say. So, and we'll come back, as you said, to some of these points in our discussion. So our third panelist is Lebohang. And Lebohang, I'd like to ask you, please, too, to reflect on some of these big issues. And thank you again so much for joining us. So you have a long history of working on issues to do with imperialism, particularly in the African and most specifically South African context. So again, just like our other two speakers have spoken, what for you have been some of the main challenges, some of the main lessons learned, maybe some of the victories in trying to dismantle, I don't know whether you use the framework of racial capitalism or economic imperialism, or whichever framework is the one that you find the most productive. But give us a sense of what you see as the challenges and the lessons learned, and also maybe some illustrations of intersectional forms of dispossession, of oppression. You know, I think you've worked on land and land occupation, which obviously in the South African context is a huge issue. So perhaps you could give us some ways of broadening our discussion. We've been talking in a way about metropolitan situations, I think, a lot, you know, struggles in cities and struggles in healthcare. But how do you see this from your vantage point? So over to you, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Jacqueline, and to my co-speakers for setting the scene so brilliantly and with such grace and conceptual clarity, which assists immensely. And of course, I give respect to the struggles of the Roma people across the world, and would like to situate this conversation in that context. So thank you for that introduction as well, Jacqueline. I think the context of my work is exactly that. It's around mainly international power, international settler colonialism and its different manifestations. And I've been fortunate enough to be situated in South Africa for the last 20 years, but I'm actually a child of many places as a result of that dislocation and displacement. And I think that's a useful way to start and to parachute into this. So the notion, of course, of South African settler imperialism is one of the main challenges, I think, is one of naming. And for many years, many of us spent a long time and spent a lot of volume and energy in the renaming and the reframing of this as a settler colonial question rather than apartheid, a colonialism of a special type, which is, of course, the neoliberal, quite white-led Eurocentric approach to it, kind of a soft imperialism, a soft colonialism. And there's nothing soft, and there is nothing soft about the notion of settler imperialism and its ongoing ontologies and manifestations in the South African context. And I think that's the first thing, the challenge of naming. And I think naming is a form of not only activism, but a form of insurrection, in fact. It's a huge thing to name oneself, to name one's struggle, and to name and to dismantle appropriately, because this gives epistemic clarity, and it also assists in giving a sense of the tools that are necessary. I think Audre Lorde has given us a wealth in relation to the tools. What tools are we going to use if we are not naming appropriately? I think the practice of white settler colonialism has been informed, of course, in this country, across the African continent, and across the global south and parts of the global north, by the way. And one would include the north, the south in Europe, for example, the south in the north. It's informed by the logic of white supremacy, and it's also developed by the concept of racial extractivism, as well as mineral and resource extractivism. So the notion of land occupation in South Africa being a metaphor for so many other forms of occupation. In fact, South Africa, as we're aware, is the country that gave the conceptual clarity of what we call racial capitalism. I think people like Neville Alexander, Edward Webster, and others. And of course, we borrowed heavily from scholars like Walter Rodney, and of course have leaned on people like Frantz Fanon, Cedric Robinson, I might add Dr. Motsuko Pheko, not just because he's my dad, among other things, but because he's really one of the great colonial, post-colonial critics and scholars. But I think that this is really an important thing of naming, and also, of course, enabling us to understand that racial capitalism and settler capitalism in this country are very extractive. So the logic of it was extraction of black and brown bodies, particularly from rural to urban areas. So extracting black men to work in the mines in order to extract more resources, which were then exported out, whether it's gold and silver and diamonds and so forth. And of course, extracting black women from the same rural areas to come and raise, extracting them from our own families, to come and raise white families, white children, and removing them. So the extraction and the dismantling as well of black families. And these are all phenomena that we see the impact of even now in African families in this country. And I think I see deep resonances with the African-American experiences in some respects. The other thing, of course, is that in all of this extractivism, there was a massive build and a massive push towards different kinds of capital. So there's some people who talk about monopoly capital, and I think that's a misnomer. So the different kinds of capital were, the main ones were the resource mineral, which were really outward looking, mainly European, mainly the Swiss, the British and others. And it's even to this day, of course, we saw with the Lonmin Marikana mine that much of the extractiveness of that situation was outward looking, and that Lonmin is still based in London. And so there's of course a genealogy that's both linear, geographic, and political in the struggles of 150 years ago and the extractivism of then, and the Marikana moment of 2012. The second piece of that is, of course, in terms of land occupation, that most of the cartels, the agricultural cartels in this country, there are about 7 key families or 7 key cartels which control most of the food and livestock production in this country. And that's more African space, which would be inward looking, although of course subject to export, to export production. Now, in all of this, there are things that we see, and this is why I think some people have mistook the apartheid regime for a civil rights movement or for a civil rights struggle rather than a struggle of land dispossession. The one, of course, is that in order to enable this extractivism to be fully maximized, the white settler regime, the Bavarian regime from 1948, had to enable control. So a lot of the settler colonialism is about control of black bodies within geographies. So of course, the notion of colonial geographies comes into play in this context. And much of this was around a few things. Number one, good old fashioned miscegenation, that black people and white people should not under any circumstances ever have sex. I mean, that's just the worst thing that can ever happen. The second thing, of course, is that you should not be seen in an area that you don't belong to unless you are going there for your labor to be extracted. And the third piece of that, of course, was the possibility of gathering in large numbers to, of course, organize against and over this regime. And now, what we see in this, of course, is that there's significant historical, economic, and political legacies. And these lie, I think, in the effect on subsequent generational discourse in various dimensions. What we're seeing, of course, is right now, in my view, is that we have, of course, the land issue in South Africa. And the land issue, I think, in many spaces and places keeps on reenacting. So the idea that Black people are only useful, only a utility that can be extracted, whether it's culturally, whether it's their labor, whether it's their technical expertise, whether it's linguistically, continues to replay itself. I think Robin D.G. Kelly mentions that gentrification as a new form, as an ongoing form of settler colonialism, right? So every time I visit, places like Brixton or Peckham in South London, where I spent a lot of time exiled, I'm shocked at how different they look and how they have been disemboweled of their soul. They no longer have the Caribbean flavor that I grew up with. They no longer look familiar. They don't look familiar anymore. They look like Chelsea. They look like some bistro in Manhattan. And this is really about the colonial imagination, right? The white supremacist imagination that needs to exert itself and center itself as our main focus of consideration and our center of being, in fact. I'd like to conclude by also mentioning something that I've also been working on parallel to this, is the extraction of memory. And I'm very interested and intrigued by the notion of memory and unmemory of things, of places, and of spaces. Land carries memory. Land carries our being. Even my favorite book talks about From Ashes to Ashes, and from dust to dust we will return, right? So without that, we are not able to then return to ourselves effectively. I think the other piece of that is then that if we're not able to remember ourselves, what then are we fighting towards? What kind of future, present future? And what is an intergenerational legacy for ourselves if we're not able to know and remember and reenact ourselves? Now, in terms of what you mentioned, Jacqueline, in brief, the notion of what kind of the victories, it's not as doom and gloom perhaps as I'm making it sound, but I do think that a lot of my own personal inspiration, there are a couple of them. The one is from the Black feminist movement, the African decolonial feminist movement, which I'm proudly associated to. And I think that in this way, what this movement has done and is doing now, and I think that even during the Corona crisis, we have been reenacting and reinvigorating our languages and our grammar of solidarity, is actually thinking in a transnational way around what it is we want to be, what it is that our states are, and what it is they are not, and how they enable or disable us, right? And how we determine a post-coloniality or we de-link ourselves from state imaginations. And then I think one of the most exciting things about being part of a global feminist movement and global social movements, I'm also part of international trade justice movements and migration movements, for example, is that there's an opportunity to think about and imagine solidarity despite the realities. The second piece of that, of course, is a lot of the inspiration for much of my organizing and my academic and activist work comes from the Bandung Project, right? So 1947, several leaders of then almost independent states or newly independent states, really leading lights like Nehru and Nkrumah and Tito and others, who were part of this, this notion of non-alignment and then this notion of the third way, the third world, right? So a world where there's not a centricism around either the East, the Soviet Union or the US, so now you could probably count the UK or the European Union. And I think that there's a lot of inspiration for me to be taken from that, because even the feminists in that space were very clear about the key demands that they were making, and the women who were Arab, African, Latin American, Asian, and so forth, that there was a sense of key demands around education, around self-determination, around women's citizenship, around economic demands, around self-determination of space, autonomy, and choice. So that's the second thing that I find incredibly inspiring. And lastly, the other thing that I think is very grounding, and that has been a huge part, I think, of the liberation movements across Southern Africa, across the African continent, and I think in many other parts of the Black and brown world, has been Black liberation theology. And I say this just because many of the people and many of the leading lights of our struggle have really been able to be quite insurgent, right? Because for many years, bear in mind, of course, that the Christian faith was used as a weapon of mass destruction. Be a slave and be happy about it. And that's what was really forced down our throats, particularly across the US, across the Americas, across the New World. And I think I have to also mention across this country, of course, the notion that if you were a Christian, you were somehow the possibility that you might not be trustworthy. And what Black liberation and African liberation theology, which many of the leaders of my political formation belonged to, was to reclaim Blackness and to reclaim a God who looks just like us, to reclaim a space that looks just like us, and to say, if God looks just like us, then we belong in this space. If we're created in the image of one who loves us and who has ordained that we be here, we almost have an immutable right to be here. So it takes away and deconstructs this notion that whiteness is indivisible from humanity, and the notion of recognition. So the insistence of being seen, the insistence that we're not going to be unseen. And because one of the logics of the colonial logics of the South African situation, of course, is the terra nullius, the land is empty. I mean, it's the same logic of different settler colonies, the Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, the US, and so forth. And the notion that we would be seen and that this was not an empty land, but this was a land that belonged to us, and not because we just got here by coincidence, but preordained, gives a particular pugnaciousness and a particular ebullience and firmness in our determination and our determination to be self-determined. And I think I'll leave it right there.
Wow, thank you. That was just a wonderfully provocative and rich set of comments. And I just like to highlight, I love the way you you go from renaming to recognition in a way as your two kind of key beginning and ending. So this whole question of renaming and what name and language does to positionality, to identity, to a struggle is such a critical one. I think in the Roma context, it's been also a foundational issue, moving away from terms which are considered abusive and stereotypical and derogatory to terms which name in a way that carries one's own identity and that one feels are respectful and multifaceted. So thank you for drawing attention to that. I think this whole question of language and I love your phrase, epistemic clarity, is really, really very much a part of this whole discussion. And it's actually a part of the forward moving journey that I think we're charting in this conference, you know, that renaming is part of it. Renaming the Roma struggle, renaming other struggles is really part of an epistemic clarity and a claim for recognition that is so critical. So I think that's a really very powerful contribution you made. I think secondly, your point about extractivism is just seminal. I mean, your illustrations about, you know, extraction of land, extraction of people, extraction of labor are so foundational when you think about current oppression. I mean, unfortunately, this is not the past, this is the present. You know, I do a lot of work in India. You could say exactly the same, you know, and we've seen it in the COVID crisis, you know, so many millions of migrant workers, labor is extracted who have nothing but their labor to keep them from poverty. And once that labor is, you know, let go because of the close down of society with the pandemic, you know, they're completely destitute despite years and years of work. So it's a very, very important point. And the way you gendered it, you know, so men extracting from the mines and women, you know, basically raising other people's families at the cost of their own families. So a really, really important point. I also really think your points about the tension between outward looking and inward looking, and no doubt they're closely connected, those forms of capital extraction are powerful. And again, the South African example is perhaps clearer than many, but it's by no means unique. So I think a really important point. And then, you know, just to add to this really big picture that we're drawing, you know, which your two previous panelists also do. I mean, the way you bring in the Bandung conference and this notion of the third space or the third way, the third world, is of course part of the struggle to get away from the kind of a binary white dominant perspective of the world. And so I think your final comment about recognizing oneself in whatever the theistic or other framework that gives meaning to life, recognizing oneself, one's people, one's own identity in that is so important. So thank you, really very profound comments, which really add actually also a spiritual dimension to the political and advocacy project that we're embarked on. So thank you for that very much. So our final panelist before we come to our discussant is Eddie Bruce Jones, who's I think based in London. So Eddie, I'd like you to add to this rich conversation from your European vantage point. You know, we those of us who are sitting in America at the moment have seen this, you know, belated centralization of the problem of racism and racial hatred and racial violence through what's been happening in this country, through the political trials of the last years. From a European perspective, how does this look to you? How do you see the kind of similarities and differences in a way between the European and the American struggles? And maybe say something about how you think of race and racism in Europe as distinctive and linked to, but also maybe different from other types of racism that we've been discussing. We've been talking about Haiti, we've talked about South Africa. What about in the European context and in the British context, actually, you know, which is, of course, you know, was the biggest empire for so long. So yeah, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Jacqueline, and thanks to my colleagues who have really given me so much to think about, and really honored to be sharing this space with you all. And there are lots of things that resonated, so I'll bring those in as I kind of give my impressions of race in Europe and how it relates to what we've been talking about. I think one thing that Liepollo mentioned was epistemic clarity, and that's something that I think is really lacking in Europe in terms of being able to have a language that's both kind of a common language for looking at strands of racism as they affect different groups, but also a language that somehow is doesn't face such an uphill battle for being understood. So I think one commonality across Europe is that local context, and when I say that, I'm really thinking of governments and political leaders and even legal institutions, find it hard to, or maybe purposefully, erode the vocabulary of racism. And we see that happening in various ways, but one of the ways that I noticed 20 years ago when I moved to Europe was that, you know, when race was mentioned, not even just by me, and I'm from the United States, but I would be privy to conversations about race and racism in Europe. And, you know, one of the first things that you'd hear is, oh, well, race is an American obsession, and we don't really have race. We have, and then you'd hear a proxy. We have ethnicity, or we have immigration, or we have, you know, we have religious differences. So really what it's about is Christianity versus the cultural integration of people who aren't Christian. So there would be all of these proxies used. You know, we use language to measure race and racism. We use, you know, where people live are they living in the banlieue? And then maybe we can talk about people who are living in a certain place. So it seemed to me this desperate, you know, search for a set of proxies that would help avoid talking about things in terms of race. And then on one hand, you know, as someone who was new to Europe at the time, I kind of understood the impulse, because not having been exposed to a society that was not so wedded to racial discourse, for in my naive mind, kind of then, I thought that being wedded to racial discourse meant also ascribing to kind of the perpetuation of racism. But over the years, or very quickly actually, I realized that it was the reverse. Not being able to have a clear vocabulary about race and racism really made it impossible to identify it, to talk about it, to actually be clear about what people were experiencing. And that made it very difficult to form alliances that were really rooted in a common experience. And so I think that lack of clarity, and it's not a lack of clarity amongst people who are organizing, it's more of a lack of a common space to have certain discussions on a large scale that are at least recognized by certain legal institutions, which can be really important to have kind of at your disposal. So while law isn't always the answer to everything, law can be used in ways to make kind of small steps to enable more capacity building and that sort of thing. That was very difficult because the language was being resisted. So a couple of ways in which that happens in Europe. One example, and I think is one of the more extreme examples in Europe, is France. And France has a position where race is not recognized as a category, and furthermore, it's criminalized as a category. So in order to talk about race, one has to, you know, if one's going to base their arguments about race and racism in statistics, those statistics aren't going to be available in France unless they're kind of commissioned by a third party under some very small exception in French law. because to use the category even to measure racism is unavailable, it's outlawed. So that makes it very difficult to talk about racism using kind of social science methods, which are, which is a disadvantage when you're trying to then shift policy or enact some sort of legal change. But the French argument is, well, we want to just unsee that type of treatment in the terms of racism. We'd rather look at how people are treated because of where they're living or what money they have access to, et cetera, because it's more important to be French first and then all the differences come later. And that perspective really puts a wall up between, activists and organizers and people who are, let's say, bereaved family members who are being accosted by the police or something like that. It puts up a big barrier to them actually being able to build networks to achieve some sort of change. In most of Europe, there's a presumption that collecting racial data is prohibited with some exceptions, rather than the reverse, which would be that it's allowed, except in some circumstances. It's generally either prohibited or it's not supported, which means the government doesn't participate in wide-scale racial data collection. And on the European level, there are some surveys that are across Europe, but the terminology of the surveys isn't in terms of race. It's usually either ethnicity or language or nationality or religion. And those things are used to create a composite picture, which isn't necessarily always going to give you a good idea of what's happening and how people are experiencing racism. So that's one part of the problem. Another part of the problem of across Europe, I think, is that there's a lack of recognition and vocabulary around institutional and systemic and structural forms of racism. I mean, let alone racial capitalism, which I'll kind of come to in a minute. But even just the basics of thinking about patterns of discrimination or thinking of discrimination and racism historically rather than ahistorically, those things are also marginalized within discussions of racism because, again, in a lot of European countries, the common understanding in policy and legal spheres is that these patterns are unable to actually tell us more about the contemporary story. Their history, we've moved on, the progress has been made, and now we're in a situation where we recognize that difference is both important and unimportant, and we should just ignore the idea that the historical timeline has anything to do with it. And we see that in, as recently as a week and a half ago in the United Kingdom, where the government commissioned a report that was written by a set of experts who were by and large people of color. So footnote here is that just because someone might have experienced racism does not mean that they're operating with epistemic clarity necessarily. So this report was commissioned, and their findings were that institutional racism in the UK is largely over. We've dealt with it. It doesn't really exist anymore. And if it exists, it's in such a small percentage that we actually shouldn't use the words anymore. We should really just be talking about disparities, unexplained disparities and explained disparities, racial disparities, but not talk about it as racism or discrimination. And so institutional discrimination is then kind of something that's so marginal that we can forget about it. And furthermore, the UK is a beacon. I mean, this is almost verbatim for the report, is a beacon of hope for the rest of Europe and the world. Meanwhile, in the same time period, in the last few years, we've had, the hostile environment policy, which was literally the name of the committee, Hostile Environment Committee in government, that was set up to make it mandatory for service providers, for landlords, schools, all of this, all of these kind of private people in these institutions or service provision to check on the immigration status of people who are renting apartments or going to school or working. And those things made it very difficult for people to survive if they were either undocumented, but it also increased the rate of housing discrimination because landlords didn't want to rent to people who they even thought might have issues with their papers, which meant racial discrimination. We had the Windrush scandal, which, you know, I don't need to talk about, but I mean, it was basically the Home Office had destroyed a bunch of documentation about the immigration status of mainly Caribbean British people who had been here for generations, and then many of them were deported. We've had, you know, we have this recent policing bill, which aims to restrict protest based on noise levels. I mean, that's one of the things in the policing bill. It's like protests can be restricted because of the noise levels that they'll contribute to. Basically, because of the Black Lives Matter protests and the Extinction Rebellion protests that have been happening in the UK. But all of this in a conglomerate way shows the scope for addressing issues of race and racism and how it overlaps with things like housing. I mean, we had the Grenfell disaster, which was by and large, you know, it was a building that went up that was cladded in a way that it shouldn't have been. It was actually against regulation and burned down. And the majority, if not all, of the people who were inside were either ethnic minorities or migrants to the UK. And so, I mean, this is kind of the backdrop to saying that there's no institutional discrimination. So there's really a lack of, it's not only the vocabulary, there's a willfulness about not recognizing what people are facing and how they're able to survive. And I guess just one other example before kind of just rounding out here is the spate of cases that go kind of a bit farther and prevent people from helping one another. And that's also very pernicious, but it's also within the realm of exploring how racial capital and racial capitalism as a framework for analysis that all of my colleagues have mentioned is worthwhile for thinking about Europe and what's at stake for letting people help one another. So for example, there is an Italian law that an organization run by a German captain of a ship, I think her name was Pia Klemp. It basically forbids people from helping ships that are going to, you know, that are small ships that are basically thought to be holding people who are migrating without paperwork from Libya or from parts of Africa, under the idea that they're being smuggled in. So to help people will be to help human trafficking, but actually it's quite obvious that those who are being targeted with these laws are those who are setting out to help people who are in distressed vessels, who are going to otherwise, you know, die in the Mediterranean, with high fines and prison time. And so that's one type of law. And a similar law in Hungary is where, you know, even lawyers and human rights NGOs are being, you know, threatened with fines or jail for helping people who are undocumented to even get legal advice to fight their claims. And all of this is happening on the fault lines of migration, but also race. And it's about, you know, part of it's about the ethno-nationalist myth that moral desert only lies with those who fit the picture. So that's about whiteness, that's about nationality, and it's about this rhetoric around ethno-nationalism and the right type of ethno part of the nationalism. But then there's also the question of how that relates to things like the evictions and expulsions that Roma have been facing for, you know, for decades and decades and centuries, to be honest, which are as recent as Italy, and a few years ago was calling for the expulsion of Roma to Romania and Bulgaria, even though they're European Union citizens and shouldn't face mass evictions, or the expulsions and evictions of people from their homes in a lot of Central and Eastern Europe, or in the UK in respect to both Roma and Irish travelers, who share kind of a similar space legally in terms of fighting claims of eviction and fighting for the rights to use land. So, I mean, all of these things I think are turning when I hear about race and racism in Europe, and I'm faced with the question of whether it exists or not. And there are so many similarities with what's going on in the United States. I think the issues of settler colonialism still affect Europe in a certain way. And I think probably in Europe, though, the question is being framed about the ability to have the rights of citizens, or rights that would be equivalent to citizens' rights, and have them be respected and understood historically within European space, rather than to have 2 or 3 tiers of citizenship, kind of a social type of citizenship within Europe, which seems to be the issue. So whenever in Europe they speak of integration, it really is about levels of citizenship and participation and access to that cultural space. So I think I'll just leave it there, because I know we're going to talk about issues of solidarity a bit later.
Eddie, thank you for those really rich comments, and kind of like you had a tough job to just discuss the whole of Europe, but I think you did a very good, you made some very insightful comments, you know, starting off by using, Lebohang's useful notion of epistemic clarity and pointing to how that's so lacking in Europe. And I think, exactly as you said, this kind of obfuscation of racism, which actually is not new. I mean, I'm much older than you, and I remember this very well in the early days of working in the 60s and 70s, actually, in the UK, where kind of, you know, racism took many forms, often linked to immigration, but not exclusively. But this kind of, this lack of clarity about how to describe it. And I think it's also very interesting, the points you made about France, which is, of course, a classic case. And now we're seeing all this kind of attack on so-called Islamo-Gauchism, but that's part of a broader, consciousness or false consciousness about, French identity, laïcité, this kind of trying to erase the reality of racism by simply not naming it, in a way, to go back to previous comments. So I think these are very important points that you're making. I mean, not to deny the complexity sometimes, because race statistics have a very dark history in many European countries. And so, this question of numbers and counting is double-faced. It's important to count, but it's important also to recognize that when you're counting, you can often be demonizing. And so there are different ways in which this functions. It's a complex issue. But I think it's really interesting. And then I think it was fascinating how you link the whole question of the hostile environment, criminalizing, people who so-called facilitation of illegal entry, which is this crime. And anybody who's interested, there's a very good Amnesty International report, which really pulls together, I think, examples from 8 different countries of criminalization of human rights defenders and others, simply for showing solidarity or empathy, but turning it into a crime. So so this kind of weaponization of a kind of attack on the other, and in a way, and this is your last point, I think, the way in which even citizenship is being deconstructed, and you're looking behind the hyphenation of the Black British or the kind of Arab French, and so you're not really British, you're not really French in the kind of top tier way, because this citizenship itself is now, as you say, a layered notion, and belonging is also layered by questions of race or religion or other kind of significant differentiators. So I think these are very important points. So thank you for bringing this in. So we have a really, really rich canvas, starting from Angela's comments and then moving through the comments of the other panelists to now kind of try to bring together. Before I turn it over to our discussant, I wondered if I could just encourage those of you who are listening, who'd like to please put any questions or comments you have in the chat. We will definitely have some time before our session ends at 11 to bring in questions from the audience or from participants who aren't on the panel. So please send your comments in, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible, just to enrich our conversation. But it's now my great pleasure to turn the mic, so to speak, over to Sunnie Rucker-Chang, who I've only actually encountered in print so far, which is really a pleasure reading your book. You have in part concentrated on comparative work, and your book, which I had the pleasure of reading, Roma Rights and Civil Rights, A Transatlantic Comparison, is a wonderful example of how rich this comparative exercise is as a tool for understanding and unpicking some of the deep issues. So I wonder if you could please just reflect for a few minutes on the topics that the panelists have raised, and there's so many of them, but maybe relate it to this perspective that you've developed in your own work, which is built on a comparative kind of approach, and linking that to the struggle for global solidarity. So yeah, thank you, Sunnie, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. First of all, I just want to thank all of the organizers whose hard work has contributed to making this 3-day event such a success. And thank you specifically to Dr. Magda Matache for the invitation to contribute to such an important conversation. What I have done as I was listening to you all speak, I was taking notes and writing sort of thoughts for each one of you. And then I'll sort of conclude by wrapping up, making broad, what I think are broad anyway, statements about what I see the connecting points between or among the 4 conversations here. So for Angela, I appreciate you taking us back to the post-1989 period and reclaiming the Romani, reclaiming of Romani knowledge, production, culture, and institution building, because I believe it's been transformative. I agree with you. It's been transnational, transhistorical, and heterogeneous. It is this, what you say, is a huge change and creates the possibility for continuing to push the narrative, which is precisely what is necessary to recast our understandings of Romani communities. To move from object to setting the terms of the conversation is really, really a significant development, in my opinion. And the proliferation of scholarship and the ways of seeing and knowing the heterogeneity of Romani communities. However, as you note, there's still work to do. And there's still so much for us to really change the perceptions and recognition of Romani people. And I speak here primarily, of course, of European Romani communities, because that's obviously the space that I work in. But I believe there remains possibilities and opportunities for transnational dialogues, which is what we're doing here. Yesterday in one of the panels, Angela Cotsey stated to rewrite the histories is to say that Roma were there, right? So it's really about reclaiming the space and reinserting Romani stories and histories back into the narrative. And so there are still challenges in telling the story, but I look forward to seeing how this develops and moves forward, as I know it will. Michelle, you spoke about embodied experiences and understanding one's place and the opportunities for transformational change, which can help define solidarity among similarly marginalized people. Which is exactly what I'm trying to do in my work these days. Solidarity indeed comes from crisis. We're surely in a global crisis at the moment. And I actually say that we're in twin crises within our transatlantic spaces. But it provides us the possibilities for forming solidarity networks, which I believe is really what we're engaged in here today. You started by speaking primarily about the AIDS crisis, the earthquake, and subsequent cholera epidemic in Haiti that was a result of the unveiling of structural inequalities and the catastrophic effects. It seems that we find ourselves at a similar moment with COVID-19 and the ongoing conversations about structural inequalities and racism in the US. And now the crisis of race has also really come into the conversation in Europe as well. So what came to mind from listening to you speak was questioning if being marginalized and affected by systemic racism and subject to racial capitalism means being either in a state of perpetual or on the precipice of crisis always. Is there always just a crisis out there on the horizon that's going to affect us eventually? Your analysis of finding points of solidarity among the crises provides, however, a path forward even in the state of crisis. And I think that it's worthwhile to state that in our conversation right now, we are finding points of solidarity amid the crisis, right? Because we all sit here and I teach, right? So I always say that I'm talking to you in your respective rectangles, right? But this is a way of moving forward amidst the crisis. So Liepollo, I should say that I found myself even snapping in some points in your talk, because it was really, really moving for me. And you started out by discussing naming and the name that you give something, because you cannot really attack or address a problem or get to its roots without naming. So the names that we give to things, the names that we assign to crises, or the names that we assign to states are very important for moving forward. And so therefore the logic of white supremacy, racial capitalism, and occupying land by way of settler colonialism presents a particular type of logic and way of being that assigns hierarchical value to bodies and helps to undergird the structure of society. As someone who finds myself situated in a settler colonial society, I find that this is an important way for seeing and understanding and knowing and moving forward. It also allows the narrative of ways of understanding to change, which can help to dictate the terms of the structures. You spoke about apartheid as being framed as exceptional, but in reclaiming and renaming the settler colonialism, we are able to recenter our understanding and restructure how we discuss the phenomenon of dispossession and reclamation. You spoke in reference to land, but also memory and reclaiming bodies. And as a Southeast European scholar, I appreciate your discussion of Bandung and the non-aligned movement, because as Walter Mignolo discusses in many ways, that moment, 1961 and 1956, represents the origins of decoloniality and presenting new ways of seeing, understanding, and recentering knowledge. This, of course, provides us with frameworks to trace the lineage and points of solidarity with deep historical ties, and being seen again points us back to Angela's original points about Romani visibility and scholarship, knowledge production, and institution building, and refusing to remain invisible. Eddie, epistemic clarity, or what David Goldberg and Alana Lenton speak to about is as racial amnesia. There are not working definitions to provide any means of moving forward, right? If we don't, and returning to what Liepollo said, if we don't have names for it, how can we tackle it? How can we address it? I appreciate your discussion of France, because as Mami Fatou Liang has noted, there are not even words for these concepts, which allows the problem to be displaced or imagined as being elsewhere. The lack of racial data also allows for the perpetuation of racial ignorance, and also innocence, I would say. For example, if someone were to seek to write about how certain groups are disproportionately affected by COVID-19, which I've tried to do recently, the data is absent, and the ways that structural racisms affect health outcomes remain invisible, therefore making it possible to continue to discount race as an active category. So it seems that there is racism in these contexts, but not race. And I continue to be puzzled by the fact that I have similar conversations about race and racism in former seats of empire and in spaces that were historically colonized, meaning in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe. It's the same conversation about the absence of race, which speaks to how pervasive this idea about race and its non-existence within European context is. This in turn then, I think, relates all the way back to what the conversation that was happening about curricula and reclaiming stories in curricula and reinserting discussions about how race really undergirds our system of capitalism, our systems of structuring knowledge, and our systems of assigning worth to bodies. So that's that. And in conclusion, solidarities and making what is imagined real, actionable, and forward thinking are the overarching themes, I think, or at least some of the overarching themes of these 4 talks. I think that our panelists have offered incredibly insightful and broad and provide us pathways for moving forward in our embodied experiences, our subject positions, but also our place transnational relative, and our place as transnational, relatively mobile individuals in our various professions. What we can see from the presentations is the interconnectedness of the processes and the ways of racial capitalism, structural inequalities, and systemic oppressions, and the way that they move throughout the world as a result of the foundations of the systems which we have given, which we have prioritized and centered in our global interactions. We first need to configure the ways that we talk about these issues to show comparative and relational structures and work together to reframe the ways that we talk about race, which provides a multitude of ways to move forward. I think that if we undergird our conversations or what is undergirding this conversation is race, right? Be it the conversations wherever, as we move throughout our global spatial positionings, we are talking about race, right? But if we don't have the words, if we don't have the ways to talk about it, if we don't have the ways of seeing it or always placing it as somewhere else, we are always finding ourselves back talking in circles and not being able to progress. So there are myriad ways to discuss and address these issues, but until we can name the problem, as I've said multiple times, and as has come up in these discussions very pointedly, it will be very difficult to move beyond our work. We will continue to be speaking to each other. However, once we recognize and address the trappings of whiteness, nationalism, racism, systemic exclusion, and how it relates to a number of issues, there will be ways for systemic change, I believe, transnational change and solidarity networks. What the Romani rights movement has taught us and the various institution building that is happening shows us the power of baby steps, which while seemingly small, allows significant movement and ways forward. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That was a wonderful, rich kind of bringing together of these contributions, and I think illustrates so beautifully how meaningful these encounters are, even if they are mediated through these screen squares. I think all of us have learned, and it's just enriching to move across these many different examples, many different experiences, some autobiographical, some theoretical. So thank you all. Before I turn to our panelists to respond, I thought I would just draw in a couple of the questions from our audience and give them a chance in a way to participate, albeit mediated by me. And so we have already got, I think, 5 questions. I don't know if we're going to get to them all, but I'd like to start with the first one, actually, which builds on the notion of extraction that Lebohang talked about so powerfully, and relate it to the Roma experience, which is in a way the kind of building block on which this encounter is framed. So maybe Angela, but any of you really who feels competent, whoever would like to do this, Sunnie, maybe, could you reflect on how extraction, in your view, has manifested itself in the Roma context? We heard very rich kind of comment about South Africa and about extraction, both from the earth and from human beings. How do you think of this in the Roma context? What's the most what are some of your reflections? So yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I can start actually, and my colleagues will pick it up and develop further. So I think the 2 questions are very much related, the extraction and racial capitalism, because as far as I remember that, racial capitalism, we always going to go back to Robinson's, Cedric Robinson, right? Robinson Cedric, sorry, I'm using the Hungarian base to enlist the name. So when he was talking about the racial capitalism as a kind of process of extracting of social, cultural, political values from the racialized people, right? And thinking about Roma, I mean, first of all, we already, try to point out that how hard to talk about Roma under the framework of racialization. So I'm still, struggling even in my own academic circle as well, when I'm talking about racialization and structural racism and naming it, that sometimes, some senior colleagues gonna tell me, oh, what the hell you want to say about that? It's so obsolete to think about race and racism is just not relevant in this context. So I think there is this kind of obscuration, right? Occluding the roots of the structural issues, and without addressing that. So we are going back again, without naming, without addressing, without framing properly, without diagnosing properly a certain issues, we're not gonna move further. And I think now it's a turning point, and I'm sure that many of you who are listening this conversation presentation, as well as my colleagues at the panel. So we know that critical Romani studies made this kind of shift toward critical race theory. How can we integrate Romani issues into this critical race framework, which can provide a more complex understanding about the historical injustice what Roma had to face in Europe, but not just in Europe, in US, in North America, Latin America, and in many other places, because in fact, indeed, we are talking about the global diaspora. But the point is that how can we think about racial capitalism in the context of the European Roma, right? So I believe, so I'm writing about it right now. So I'm finalizing my own monograph and manuscript as well. And in fact, I mean, if we are talking about racial capitalism and structural racism, that we are challenging this kind of fantastic capitalist system around us and imperialism, right? And usually, if you're gonna check the scholarship in Roma, we are always talking about, you know, disadvantages, and they are behind, and they are disadvantages as a special characteristics of Roma, right? And not talking about the roots of the problem, that why are they in such a position, like in terms of education, employment, housing, and many other fields. They are because, I mean, first of all, there is an accumulated disadvantages, right? And which has been escalated and manifested through histories, and also there is a structural impediments which basically not allows them to progress or to make a step further. And I think without recognizing this kind of historical injustice, without addressing, without reconciling with that, then we're going to remain in the denial, because that's the way how I would call it. It's simply a denial, a lack of will, and actually a kind of academic blindness or deafness to this very specific mechanism. So going back to racial capitalism, and certainly it's an extraction. If I'm going to stay in the realm of academia, so knowledge has been extracted from Roma, right? I mean, just think about it. I mean, everybody who was working on Roma or any Roma issues were not Roma. I mean, I'm not saying that these people are not a good people. So they are scholars, and of course they have a right to do their research and work on whatever field they want. But what did they think about the, you know, the how can we bring these people into this realm, right? And how can we create an opportunities for them? It didn't really happen, and I think that's what we are doing right now. I mean, what I'm doing, you know, leading the Roma graduate preparation program, or what Magda and Jackie is doing at Harvard, I really feel that this is a kind of you know, rectifying structural racism and rectifying extraction of knowledge and information from Roma, and we try to enable and give back the space and reclaiming history, reclaiming knowledge, and you have a right, and you do not, and right is not enough. We have to create a condition, right, to be able to reclaim and rework that kind of history and create a counter history and counter narrative.
So thank you, Angela. I think what you're saying is an interesting gloss, or interesting way of using this concept of extraction. So the way Lebohang framed it was really extraction of raw materials, extraction of labor, as a kind of, you know, the bedrock of, if you like, capitalism, of racial capitalism, any type of capitalism, this kind of, going back to Marx. I think what you're saying is that kind of extractive project has a much broader embedding. So it's not so much that you're extracting people's knowledge, but you're denying them the conditions in which they can actually own their own knowledge, just like you're denying them the conditions in which they can own their own land. You're denying them the conditions in which they can own and not alienate their own labor. So the process is an exploitative process. It's creating, I mean, that I think is how you've applied it, which is very interesting. So it applies not just to resources such as land or kind of minerals or labor, but it applies to this whole exploitative context in which people are denied access to fundamental rights, if you're using a rights-based framework, for example, which is, I think, a really powerful way of conceiving of this. So, and that's exactly what we're seeing. And I think, the issues of naming and of recognizing and recognition and epistemic clarity are also informing this in a very useful way. So thank you. I think this is, I'm sure the other panelists have things to say. Okay, Michelle, I'll call on you. And then I wanted to just bring in some other questions. But Michelle, yeah, please.
Just really, really briefly, and yeah, thank you again, Angela, for describing that. I just wanted to add the additional example of, in addition to extraction, it is the unfair and oppressive use of existing state resources and other resources to continue that oppression. And the example I wanted to offer up is just from New York City. Some of the social epidemiologists here have looked at just, and it's not just in New York City, but many places, the cost of incarcerating folks, and many scholars have looked at this, but I want to just lift up this example from New York City, where folks at one of the universities here looked at one of the most kind of incarcerated communities here in New York City, in Brooklyn, where it's about 3.5% of the city population, but around 8.5% of people incarcerated, and looked at the cost of incarcerating those folks and found that it was over $11 million in 1 year to incarcerate folks from that community. And that, that $11 million boiled down to about $1 million per block. So there were 11 blocks from which these individuals came from that were clearly like heavily targeted and incarcerated. And so you just think about, just in 1 year, $11 million to incarcerate a handful of people from 11 blocks. And again, how that connects to both extraction and then use of the extracted resources to continue that cycle of oppression and marginalization. And again, just another.
That's a fantastic example. So this is extraction of state funding. It's a kind of stealing or a misappropriation. So Angela, I think this is at least a footnote in whatever you're writing, but that's just my suggestion. But thank you. That was really a lovely exchange. So if I may, I'm going to move on now. I think we've actually dealt with the excellent second question, which is also about this concept of racial capitalism, and time is marching on. So let me move to the third question, which does slightly shift to something we have discussed, but I think it would be great to discuss in a bit more depth. And the question is this, and I'm going to read it. Can you share some thoughts on data sovereignty for the Roma people when considering collecting race-based data? So this is a question that Eddie raised, and that a critical question about race-based data. So what about data sovereignty for Roma? So the floor is open. Whoever'd like to jump in, please feel free. And actually, I can't see, I can only see like a quarter of Eddie and a quarter of Angela for some reason. But anyway, yeah, please.
Maybe I can start, since I was kind of left
please,
off.
Eddie, go ahead.
I'll be really brief, though. I think one of the things is what Angela mentioned right at the beginning of her presentation, which is nothing about us without us. So that mantra, I think, is really important when designing how data is conceived of and then collected, stored, and used. And I was at, many years ago now, at a meeting in Germany about this very issue, because racial data isn't collected in Germany by the state. And it was with a whole range of institutions, NGOs and community groups, including people who were representing Roma communities, Black communities, Muslim communities, etc. And part of the concern was the mistrust with the state and the use of the concepts that the state would then be using. But it was really kind of the lesser of two evils at the end of the day, and figuring out how to calibrate that mistrust against the benefits of having an ability to track certain types of patterns of discrimination. But I think the big challenge was how to carve out a role for community groups and people who are being affected by discrimination to participate in conceiving of the system. So I guess in terms of the idea of data sovereignty, it is a difficult one to conceive of having sovereignty over the data once it's out there and once it's being used. But I think keeping some sort of clarity around how the data is being used, in what cases it's going to be voluntarily collected, because in the majority of cases it would be voluntary anyway. Even on the census in the UK, it's a voluntary question on the census. But then how it's then being used and how it's being framed. And I know from reading, reports that Roma and Jewish communities across Europe are some of the most skeptical about the state using their data, and for good reason, because where it is known, it's abused. So I think it's probably maybe a longer term conversation for how to conceive of a system that then has the support available to ensure, at least, or to monitor the use of the data so that it's not misused so immediately by certain institutions. And one way to do that is maybe firewall policing institutions from having access to the data until it can be regulated in a more transparent way, so there's oversight of police, because that's one institution where it's notoriously been abused when it's known.
So thank you, Eddie. I mean, this is a really complicated question, I think. There are, I would say, a couple of key issues. One issue is, why is the data being collected in the first place? What's the point? Because data for data's sake is really not productive. So, you collect something in order to act on it or to notice it. So I think that informing that political debate, first of all, is critical, and that's where I think the question of self-determination comes in, when people, or sovereignty, when data is collected about a community, that community has to have a say in what data is collected, and what it's going to be used for, and how it's going to be named, and how it's going to be stored, and who's going to have access. So that's one thing. And the second thing, which you also, I think, pointed to quite rightly, is the question of access. Who has access, and why do they have access? So first of all, why collect it in the first place? And secondly, who has access? And for example, in the US context, it's interesting. I recently participated in an event. They were talking about the way in which ICE, the Immigration Customs Enforcement Agency, which is the agency that arrests people and deports people with irregular status, have now got access to enormous amounts of information, including all the information about address and identity from the DMV, from the people who have your driver's licenses. And so they have been arresting people, including undocumented people, who have in states that have, for good reason, given undocumented people access to driver's licenses so that they can drive and not be harassed. Now ICE has gone after that data, and people trustingly gave their information to the DMV, to the, whatever it's called, Department of Motor Vehicles, in order to drive and to lead a normal life. And here they find themselves now arrested and deported. And similarly with electricity companies. So the question of firewalling, as you mentioned it, of separating access to data which has clear privacy and safety implications for some communities, and it's another very political and complex issue. And I think it's again a question of political power. Who is at the table when these decisions are being made? It's not a simple question. It's not, these are not easy questions. So I'm really glad we're discussing this. Sunnie, I think you had your hand up.
Yes, and I'll be brief because I see that our time is becoming very short here. The point that you just raised about who's at the table and who's making decisions, I think is one that has to be addressed, right? Because if people do not see their interest being represented, then of course they're going to be unwilling to provide that information. But I also wanted to say that by continuing not to have racial data, and I completely respect people's unwillingness to provide that data, right? But by not having it, it becomes possible to continue to say that there are not disparities among these groups, because, and I just experienced this recently where I was actually submitting a paper and someone said, well, where are the numbers? There are no numbers, right? And because there are no numbers, I can't prove my points, which then we keep going in circles, right? And so then how can you prove what isn't discoverable, where there's information lacking? So, and that's all I will say.
It's a critical point. Thank you for raising it. Briefly, another important question, which we haven't really discussed very much, we've hinted at, but we haven't discussed very much. So I'm glad this question has been raised. So what has been the impact of COVID-19 on Roma, on their living conditions, in particular, Roma living in rural communities? How's the system handled it? And what do we know about the impact of this pandemic on this marginalized communities? So the floor is open, and I don't know who would like to jump in. And I'm sure any comparative comments would be also welcome, but the question is specifically about Roma. I mean, does anybody want to jump in? I know that my colleague Magda has actually researched this very carefully. I don't know if I can bring her in from the depths of the audience somewhere, but this is a very important point. So if Uncle Sunnie, any of you don't feel you have the data at your fingertips, and Magda, would you mind just jumping in and answering this important question?
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Jackie. I'll try to answer briefly because I also hope that the others will join this conversation. But I think that the question came from a colleague in New York, an American Roma, and the concern about Roma communities in Europe, especially those living in rural areas, is really one that is valid and is real. So what we noticed during the COVID-19 pandemic were several patterns. One was the deepening of structural inequalities. Many Roma who were doing essential work, they remain without jobs. Those who were involved in more informal activities were, as for instance, collecting bottles and so on. They also had to be inside. So there was no income in these families. So from this perspective of economics and social and economic realities, we see a drop. On the other hand, we talk about education. For centuries, we hear that Roma don't want to go to school and that it is in our culture not to go to school. But the reality is that education is also extracted from us in times of pandemic, where we see is that in rural Roma communities and in other communities, Roma children do not have access to the internet, and therefore for a year, many of them have not been able to go to school or to participate in classes along with their and non-Roma classmates. At the same time, we see that history repeats itself, and this would be perhaps my last point. Throughout the pandemics, every century when we had a pandemic, Roma were scapegoated for that pandemic. If we talk about the Black Death, if we talk about typhus, if we talk about plague, Roma were either isolated in their communities, or they are not allowed to be part of the larger non-Roma community, European white community, because they were seen and portrayed as transmitters of disease. This is the reality today. And we see that not only through the media, but also we see it in the behavior and the policies that and measures that policymakers at the local level and the national level implement. And most often they put Roma at the margins. There are targeted policies, policing, militarization of Roma communities during the pandemic. So we definitely see a dramatic effect of the pandemic on Roma. And talking about a lack of data, we also don't know how many Roma die during the pandemic, how many Roma are affected by the pandemic. And I dare to say that every day I see Roma people who die. And unfortunately, because we don't collect data, we don't have those numbers.
Thank you, Magda. Thank you for making those points. Angela.
No, I'm just happy that Magda jumped in our discussion. I think that was really important. But also I would like to point out, actually, there was an article a few days ago by the Reuters, and they wrote about the feeling like flies. Roma are feeling like flies. So I think that's a really, really strong message, which really reflect on the situation. And I would say that, the whole COVID, it's really a kind of caricatures of our racial capitalism, right? People who's been neglected, ignored, abandoned, they are completely out, not just from our social space and horizon, but really from our imagination. And there is no healthcare access. We don't know anything. They have no income in the family. So it's terrible. It's really dramatic, and no one knows about it. And of course, we have no data. I mean, official data, and no one wants to go to this kind of segregated, abandoned communities because we are afraid to contract the virus. But the point is, going back to racial capitalism, it's really a crisis, guys. We know that, capitalism is producing crisis, but this crisis, how can we change it? How can we subvert this crisis? And can we use it? Just, underlining one of my message, what I told, that this kind of collective, indignation, that we just can't continue in the same way as we did, because it's a tragedy. And I mean it's a time to change. And I'm really glad, actually, that on this International Romani Day, we are really honoring those peoples who are sacrificing their life and who are suffering for so many ages. And we have to stand up and speak up and use this kind of global solidarity to talk about it.
Thank you, Angela. That's such an important, both of you, thank you for those really important points, mentioning both the problem of actually counting and knowing and data, again, coming into this. If you don't have access to state institutions in an equitable way, then your own suffering and your own exclusion passes unnoticed. Also, the kind of more general point about the demonization of the other, and how historically Roma, amongst the other groups we've mentioned, have been seen as purveyors of disease and so on. And then also how, this latest pandemic crisis has been no different from others, and how as Angela says, how tragic and shameful it is in this day and age that this should be even possible, that you could have particular communities demonized and blamed for being denied access to adequate healthcare. We are unfortunately out of time. This has been such a rich conversation, and actually we have a couple of excellent questions we haven't even got to. But I really hope that the seeds of this conversation, and I'm confident that the seeds of this conversation will continue. This is really an incredibly generative forum, I think, and really congratulate the organizers on bringing all of us, all of you together on this momentous day. I hope very much that some of these oral contributions will find their way into print and into other media so that they can be more widely disseminated. And let me thank you again, all of you, for your very thoughtful, rich comments and presentations. And thank you again to the home teams for making this possible, including our colleagues Veronica and Rovid and others who are behind the scenes have enabled this. So many thanks, and hope to all convene in real time and real space before too long. So thank you and take care. Bye.